Part 3. The Law of the Tendential Fall in the Rate of Profit. Chapter 13. The Law Itself. Once wages and the working day are given, a variable capital, which we can take as 100, represents a definite number of workers set in motion. It is an index of this number. Say that 100 pounds provides the wages of 100 workers for a week. If these 100 workers perform as much surplus labor as necessary labor, then they work as much time for the capitalist each day for the production of surplus value as they do for themselves, for the reproduction of their wages, and their total value product would then be 200 pounds, the surplus value they produce amounting to 100. The rate of surplus value, S over V, would be 100%. Yet, as we have seen, this rate of surplus value will be expressed in very different rates of profit, according to the differing scale of the constant capital small c, and hence the total capital C, since the rate of profit is S over C. If the rate of surplus value is 100%, we have, if small c equals 50 and V equals 100, then P prime, the rate of profit, equals 100 over 150, 66 2/3%. If small c is 100 and V is 100, then P prime equals 100 over 200, 50%. If small c is 200 and V is 100, then P prime is 100 over 300, a rate of profit of 33 1/3%. If small c is 300 and V is 100, then P prime is 100 over 400, 25%. And if small c is 400 and V is 100, then P prime is 100 over 500, 20%. The same rate of surplus value, therefore, and an unchanged level of exploitation of labor is expressed in a falling rate of profit, as the value of the constant capital, and hence the total capital, grows with the constant capital's material volume. If we further assume now that this gradual change in the composition of capital does not just characterize certain individual spheres of production, but occurs in more or less all spheres, or at least the decisive ones, and that it therefore involves changes in the average organic composition of the total capital belonging to a given society, then this gradual growth in the constant capital, in relation to the variable, must necessarily result in a gradual fall in the general rate of profit, given that the rate of surplus value, or the level of exploitation of labor by capital, remains the same. Moreover, it has been shown to be a law of the capitalist mode of production that its development does in fact involve a relative decline in the relation of variable capital to constant, and hence also to the total capital set in motion. See Volume 1, Chapter 25. This simply means that the same number of workers, or the same quantity of labor power that is made available by a variable capital of a given value as a result of these specific methods of production that develop within capitalist production, sets in motion, works up, and productively consumes within the same period an ever-growing mass of means of labor, machinery, and fixed capital of all kinds, and raw and ancillary materials. In other words, the same number of workers operate with a constant capital of ever-growing scale. The progressive decline in the variable capital in relation to the constant, and hence in relation to the total capital as well, is identical with the progressively rising organic composition, on average, of the social capital as a whole. It is just another expression for the progressive development of the social productivity of labor, which is shown by the way that the growing use of machinery and fixed capital generally enables more raw and ancillary materials to be transformed into products in the same time by the same number of workers, i.e. with less labor. There corresponds to this growing volume of constant capital, although this expresses only at a certain remove the growth in the actual mass of use values which the constant capital consists of in material terms, a continual cheapening of the product. Each individual product, taken by itself, contains a smaller sum of labor than at a lower stage of development of production, where the capital laid out on labor stands in a far higher ratio to that laid out on means of production. The hypothetical series we constructed at the opening of this chapter therefore expresses the actual tendency of capitalist production. With the progressive decline in the variable capital in relation to the constant, this tendency leads to a rising organic composition of the total capital, and the direct result of this is that the rate of surplus value, with the level of exploitation of labor remaining the same or even rising, is expressed in a steadily falling general rate of profit. We shall show later on why this fall does not present itself in such an absolute form, but rather more in the tendency to a progressive fall. The progressive tendency for the general rate of profit to fall is thus simply the expression, peculiar to the capitalist mode of production, of the progressive development of the social productivity of labor. This does not mean that the rate of profit may not fall temporarily for other reasons as well, but it does prove that it is a self-evident necessity deriving from the nature of the capitalist mode of production itself that as it advances, the general average rate of surplus value must be expressed in a falling general rate of profit. Since the mass of living labor applied continuously declines in relation to the mass of objectified labor that it sets in motion, i.e. the productively consumed means of production, the part of this living labor that is unpaid and objectified in surplus value must also stand at an ever-decreasing ratio to the value of the total capital applied. But this ratio between the mass of surplus value and the total capital applied in fact constitutes the rate of profit, which must therefore steadily fall. Simple as the law appears from the above arguments, not one of the previous writers on economics succeeded in discovering it, as we shall see later on. These economists perceived the phenomenon, but tortured themselves with their contradictory attempts to explain it. And given the great importance that this law has for capitalist production, one might well say that it forms the mystery around whose solution the whole of political economy since Adam Smith revolves, and that the difference between the various schools since Adam Smith consists in the different attempts made to solve it. If we consider on the one hand how previous political economy has fumbled around with the distinction between constant and variable capital, but has never managed to formulate this in any definite way, how it has never presented surplus value as something separate from profit, nor profit in general in its pure form as distinct from the various constituents of profit, which have attained an autonomous position towards each other, such as industrial profit, commercial profit, interest, and ground rent, how it has essentially never analyzed the differences in the organic composition of capital, and hence has not analyzed the formation of the general rate of profit either, then it ceases to be a puzzle that political economy has never found this puzzle solution. We are deliberately putting forward this law before depicting the decomposition of profit into various categories which have become mutually autonomous. The independence of this presentation from the division of profit into various portions, which accrue to different categories of persons, shows from the start how the law in its generality is independent of that division, and of the mutual relationships of the categories of profit deriving from it. Profit, as we speak of it here, is simply another name for surplus value itself, only now depicted in a relation to the total capital, instead of to the variable capital from which it derives. The fall in the rate of profit thus expresses the falling ratio between surplus value itself and the total capital advanced. It is therefore independent of any distribution of the surplus value we may care to make among the various categories. We have seen that at one stage of capitalist development, when the composition of capital, small c to v, is 50 to 100 for example, a rate of surplus value of 100% is expressed in a rate of profit of 66 2/3%, while at a higher stage of development, where small c to v is 400 to 100 say, the same rate of surplus value is expressed in a rate of profit of only 20%. What applies to different successive stages of development in one country applies also to different countries that find themselves in differing stages of development at the same point in time. In the undeveloped country, where the composition of capital is on the average, as first mentioned, the general rate of profit would be 66 2/3%, while in the country at a much higher level of development, it would be 20%. The distinction between the two national rates of profit could disappear, or even be reversed, if in the less developed country labor was less productive, i.e. a greater quantity of labor was expressed in a smaller quantity of the same commodity, and a greater exchange value and less use value, so that the worker would have to spend a greater portion of his time in reproducing his own means of subsistence or their value, leaving a smaller portion for producing surplus value and thus providing less surplus labor, so that the rate of surplus value would be lower. If the worker in the less advanced country worked 2/3 of the day for himself, for instance, and 1/3 for the capitalist, then on the assumption of the above example, the same labor power would be paid 133 1/3 and would provide a surplus of only 66 2/3. To the variable capital of 133 1/3, there would correspond a constant capital of 50. The rate of surplus value would now come to 50%, and the rate of profit to 183 1/3 over 66 2/3, or approximately 36 1/2%. Since we have not investigated up to now the various components into which profit is divided, so that these do not exist for us as yet, the following point is anticipated here simply for the sake of avoiding any misunderstandings. When comparison is made between countries at different levels of development, and particularly between countries of developed capitalist production and those where labor is not yet formally subsumed by capital, although in reality the worker is already exploited by the capitalist, in India, for example, where the Ryot operates as an independent peasant farmer, and his production is not yet subsumed under capital, although the moneylender may well extort from him in the form of interest not only his entire surplus labor, but even, to put it in capitalist terms, a part of his wages. It would be quite wrong to seek to measure the national rate of profit by the level of the national rate of interest. Interest here includes both the entire profit and more than the profit, whereas in countries where capitalist production is developed, it simply expresses an adequate part of the surplus value or profit produced. Moreover, in the former case, the rate of interest is predominantly determined by factors such as the level of advances by moneylenders to the big landowners, who are the recipients of ground rent, which have nothing at all to do with profit, but rather express the extent to which the moneylender himself appropriates this ground rent. In countries where capitalist production stands at different levels of development, and between which the organic composition of capital consequently varies, the rate of surplus value, as one factor that determines the rate of profit, may be higher in a country where the normal working day is shorter than in one where it is longer. Firstly, if the English working day of 10 hours is equal to an Austrian working day of 14 hours, on account of its higher intensity, then given the same division of the working day, 5 hours of surplus labor in the one country may represent a higher value on the world market than 7 hours in the other. Secondly, a greater part of the working day in England may form surplus labor than in Austria. The law of the falling rate of profit, as expressing the same or even a rising rate of surplus value, means, in other words, taking any particular quantity of average social capital, for example a capital of 100, an ever greater portion of this is represented by means of labor, and an ever lesser portion by actual living labor. Since the total mass of living labor added to the means of production falls in relation to the value of these means of production, so too does the unpaid labor, and the portion of value in which it is represented in relation to the value of the total capital advanced. Alternatively, an ever smaller adequate part of the total capital laid out is converted into living labor, and hence the total capital absorbs ever less surplus labor in relation to its size, even though the ratio between the unpaid and paid parts of the labor applied may at the same time be growing. The relative decline in the variable capital and increase in the constant capital, even while both portions grow in absolute terms, is, as we have said, simply another expression for the increased productivity of labor. Say that a capital of 100 consists of 80 constant and 20 variable, and the latter represents 20 workers. Let the rate of surplus value be 100%, so that the workers work half the day for themselves and half for the capitalist. In a less developed country, the capital might be 20 constant and 80 variable, with the latter portion representing 80 workers, but these workers might need 2/3 of the working day for themselves and work only 1/3 of the day for the capitalist. Taking everything else as equal, the workers in the first case produce a value of 40, in the second case a value of 120. The first capital produces 80 constant, 20 variable, and 20 surplus being 120. The rate of profit is 20%. The second capital produces 20 constant, 80 variable, and 40 surplus, 140, a rate of profit of 40%. This rate, in the second case, is thus twice as large as in the first case, even though the rate of surplus value in the first case was 100%, twice that in the second case where it's only 50%. The reason for this is that a capital of the same size appropriates in the first case the surplus labor of only 20 workers, as against that of 80 workers in the second case. The law of a progressive fall in the rate of profit, or the relative decline in the surplus labor appropriated, in comparison with the mass of objectified labor that the living labor sets in motion, in no way prevents the absolute mass of labor set in motion and exploited by the social capital from growing, and with it, the absolute mass of surplus labor it appropriates, any more than it prevents the capitals under the control of the individual capitalist from controlling a growing mass of labor and hence of surplus labor, this latter even if there is no increase in the number of workers under their command. If we take a given working population of 2 million, for example, and further assume that the length and intensity of the average working day is given, as well as wages, and hence also the relationship between necessary and surplus labor, then the total labor of these 2 million workers always produces the same magnitude of value, and the same thing is true of their surplus labor, as expressed in surplus value. But as the mass of constant capital, fixed and circulating, set in motion by this labor grows, so there is a fall in the ratio between this magnitude and the value of the constant capital, which grows with its mass, even if not in the same proportion. This ratio falls, and with it the profit rate, even though capital still commands the same mass of living labor as before, and absorbs the same mass of surplus labor. If the ratio changes, this is not because the mass of living labor falls, but rather because the mass of already objectified labor that it sets in motion rises. The decline is relative, not absolute, and it has in fact nothing whatsoever to do with the absolute amount of the labor and surplus labor set in motion. the fall in the rate of profit does not arise from an absolute decline in the variable component of the total capital, but simply from a relative decline, from its decrease in comparison with the constant component. What holds when the amount of labor and surplus labor is at a constant level holds also when the number of workers is growing, and when accordingly, under the given assumptions, the mass of labor under capital's command is growing in general, and its unpaid portion, surplus labor, is growing in particular. If the working population rises from 2 to 3 millions, and the amount of variable capital laid out on wages similarly becomes 3 million instead of 2, while the constant capital rises from 4 million to 15 million, then under the given assumptions, working day and rate of surplus value constant, the mass of surplus labor and surplus value still rises by a half, by 50%, from 2 to 3 million. It is nonetheless the case, however, that despite this growth of 50% in the absolute mass of surplus labor, and hence surplus value, the ratio of variable capital to constant would fall from 2 to 4 to 3 to 15, and the relationship between the surplus value and the total capital would stand as follows, in millions. In case number 1, 4 million constant, 2 variable, and 2 surplus. C is equal to 6 million, and P prime, the rate of profit, is 33.33%. In case 2, 15 million constant, 3 million variable, and 3 million surplus. C is equal to 18 million, and P prime is at 16.2%. While the mass of surplus value has risen by a half, the rate of profit has fallen to half its previous level. But profit is nothing more than the surplus value reckoned in terms of the social capital, and the mass of profit, therefore, its absolute magnitude, is the same as the absolute magnitude of the surplus value, considering it on a social scale. The absolute magnitude of profit, its total mass, would thus have grown by 50%, despite the enormous decline in the ratio between this mass of profit and the total capital advanced, i.e. despite the enormous decline in the general rate of profit. The number of workers employed by capital, i.e. the absolute mass of labor it sets in motion, and hence the absolute mass of surplus labor it absorbs, the mass of surplus value it produces, and the absolute mass of profit it produces, can therefore grow, and progressively so, despite the progressive fall in the rate of profit. This not only can, but must be the case, discounting transient fluctuations, on the basis of capitalist production. The capitalist production process is essentially, and at the same time, a process of accumulation. We have shown how with the progress of capitalist production, the mass of value that must simply be reproduced and maintained rises and grows with the rising productivity of labor, even if the labor power applied remains constant. But as the social productivity of labor develops, so the mass of use values produced grows still more, and the means of production form a portion of these. The additional labor, moreover, which has to be appropriated in order for this additional wealth to be transformed back into capital, does not depend on the value of these means of production, including means of subsistence, since the worker is not concerned in the labor process with the value of the means of production, but rather with their use value. Accumulation itself, however, and the concentration of capital it involves, is simply a material means for increasing a growth in the working population, the creation of a surplus population that corresponds to the surplus capital, or even exceeds its overall requirements, thus leading to an overpopulation of workers. A momentary excess of surplus capital over the working population it commands has a double effect. On the one hand, it'll gradually increase the working population by raising wages, hence mitigating the destructive influences that decimate the offspring of the workers, making marriages easier, while on the other hand, by using the methods that create relative surplus value, the introduction and improvement of machinery, it produces far more quickly an artificial and relative overpopulation, which in turn is the forcing house for a really rapid increase in the number of people, since under capitalist production, misery produces population. It thus follows from the very nature of the capitalist accumulation process, and this process is simply one aspect of the capitalist process of production, that the increased mass of means of production, designed to be turned into capital, finds a correspondingly increased and even excessive working population available for exploitation. As the process of production and accumulation advances, therefore, the mass of surplus labor that can be and is appropriated must grow, and with it too the absolute mass of profit appropriated by the social capital. But the same laws of production and accumulation mean that the value of the constant capital increases along with its mass, and progressively more quickly than that of the variable portion of capital which is converted into living labor. The same laws, therefore, produce both a growing absolute mass of profit for the social capital and a falling rate of profit. We entirely leave aside here the fact that the same amount of value represents a progressively rising mass of use values and satisfactions, with the progress of capitalist production and with the corresponding development of the productivity of social labor and multiplication of branches of production and hence products. The course of the development of capitalist production and accumulation requires increasingly large-scale labor processes and hence increasingly large dimensions and increasingly large advances of capital for each individual establishment. The growing concentration of capitals, accompanied at the same time, though in lesser degree, by a growing number of capitalists, is therefore both one of its material conditions and one of the results that it itself produces. Hand in hand with this, in a relationship of reciprocity, goes progressive expropriation of the more or less immediate producers. In this way, a situation comes about in which the individual capitalists have command of increasingly large armies of workers, no matter how much the variable capital may fall in relation to the constant, so that the mass of surplus value and hence profit which they appropriate grows, along with and despite the fall in the rate of profit. The reasons that massive armies of workers become concentrated under the command of individual capitalists are precisely the same reasons that the amount of fixed capital employed grows, as well as the raw and ancillary materials in a growing proportion as compared with the massive living labor applied. The only other thing that needs to be mentioned here is that with a given working population, if the rate of surplus value grows, whether by prolongation or intensification of the working day, or by reductions in the value of wages as a result of the developing productivity of labor, then the mass of surplus value, and hence the absolute mass of profit, must also grow, despite the relative lessening of variable capital in relation to constant. The same development of the productivity of social labor, the same laws that are evident in the relative fall in variable capital as a proportion of the total capital, and the accelerated accumulation that follows from this, while on the other hand this accumulation also reacts back to become the starting point for a further development of productivity and a further relative decline in the variable capital. This same development is expressed, leaving aside temporary fluctuations, in the progressive increase in the total labor power applied, and in the progressive growth in the absolute mass of surplus value and therefore in profit. How then should we present this double-edged law of a decline in the profit rate coupled with a simultaneous increase in the mass of profit arising from the same reasons? A law based on the fact that under the given conditions, the mass of surplus labor, and hence surplus value that is appropriated, grows, and that viewing the capital as a whole, or the individual capital as simply a piece of the total capital, profit and surplus value are identical quantities. Let us take an aliquot part of the capital as a basis for reckoning the profit rate, say 100. This 100 represents the average composition of the total capital, say 80 constant and 20 variable. We saw in part 2 of this volume how the average rate of profit in the various branches of production is determined not by any one particular composition of capital, but rather by its average social composition. With the relative decline in the variable portion as compared with the constant, and hence also as a fraction of the total capital of 100, the profit rate falls even if the level of exploitation of labor remains constant, or even if it rises. Hence, the relative magnitude of surplus value falls, i.e. its relationship to the value of the total capital of 100 that is advanced. But it is not only this relative magnitude that falls. The amount of surplus value or profit absorbed by the total capital of 100 also falls in absolute terms. At a rate of surplus value of 100%, a capital of 60 constant and 40 variable produces a mass of surplus value, and hence profit, of 40. A capital of 70 constant and 30 variable produces a mass of profit of 30. With a capital of 80 constant and 20 variable, the profit falls to 20. This fall bears on the mass of surplus value and hence of profit, and it follows from the fact that because the total capital of 100 sets in motion less living labor in general, it also sets in motion less surplus labor, and hence produces less surplus value, with the level of exploitation remaining the same. Whatever aliquot part of the social capital we take is the standard for measuring surplus value, i.e. whatever part of the capital of average social composition, and this is the case with any calculation of profit, a relative fall in surplus value is always identical with an absolute fall. The rate of profit falls from 40% to 30% and 20% in the above cases, because the mass of surplus value, and hence profit produced by the same capital itself, falls from 40 to 30 and then 20 in absolute terms. Since the size of the capital against which we measure the surplus value is given as 100, a fall in the ratio of surplus value to this magnitude, which itself remains constant, can only be another expression for the decline in the absolute magnitude of surplus value and profit. This is in fact a tautology, but the reason for this decline, as has been shown, lies in the nature of development of the capitalist process of production. On the other hand, however, the same reasons that produce an absolute decline in surplus value, and hence profit, on a given capital, thus also in the rate of profit as reckoned as a percentage, bring about a growth in the absolute mass of surplus value and profits appropriated by the social capital, i.e. by the totality of capitalists. How are we to explain this? What is it dependent on, or what conditions are involved in this apparent contradiction? If any aliquot part of the social capital, say 100, and hence any capital of 100 of average social composition is a given magnitude, so that as far as it is concerned, the decline in the rate of profit coincides with the decline in the absolute amount of profit, precisely because the capital on which this is measured is a constant magnitude, then the magnitude of the total social capital, on the other hand, just like that of the capital to be found in the hands of any individual capitalist, is a variable magnitude. And it must vary in inverse proportion to the decline in its variable portion if it is to fulfill the conditions we have presupposed. When the percentage composition in the previous example was 60 constant and 40 variable, the surplus value or profit on it was 40, and the rate of profit therefore 40%. Let us assume that at this level of composition the total capital was 1 million. The total surplus value and the total profit would then amount to 400,000. If the composition were later to become 80 constant and 20 variable, the surplus value, or profit, on each 100 would be 20, with the level of exploitation remaining the same. But the surplus value or profit grows in its absolute mass, as we have shown, despite this decline in the rate of profit, or the decline in the production of surplus value by each capital of 100. And this growth might be from 400,000 to 440,000, say. This is possible only if the total capital that corresponds to this new composition has grown to 2.22 million. The mass of the total capital set in motion has risen to 220% of its initial value, whereas the rate of profit has fallen by 50%. If the capital had simply doubled, then at a rate of profit of 20%, it could only have produced the same amount of surplus value and profit as the old capital of 1 million did at 40%. Had it grown by less than this, it would have produced less surplus value and less profit than the capital of 1 million did previously, although at its earlier composition this would only have had to grow from 1 million to 1.1 million in order for its surplus value to rise from 400,000 to 440,000. Here, we can see asserting itself the law that we developed earlier, according to which the relative decline in the variable capital, and thus the development of the social productivity of labor, means that an ever greater amount of total capital is required in order to set the same quantity of labor power in motion, and to absorb the same amount of surplus labor. In the same proportion as capitalist production develops, therefore, there also develops the possibility of a relative surplus working population, not because the productivity of social labor declines, but rather because it increases, i.e. not from an absolute disproportion between labor and means of subsistence, or the means of producing these, but rather from a disproportion arising from the capitalist exploitation of labor, the disproportion between the progressive growth of capital and the relative decline in its need for a growing population. A fall of 50% in the rate of profit is a fall of a half. If the mass of profit is to remain the same, therefore, the capital must double. In general, if the mass of profit is to remain the same with a declining rate of profit, the multiplier that indicates the growth in the total capital must be the same as the divisor that indicates the fall in the profit rate. If the profit rate falls from 40% to 20, the total capital must rise in the ratio of 20 to 40, if the result is to remain the same. If the profit rate had fallen from 40% to 8%, the capital would have to grow in the ratio 8 to 40, i.e. by 5 times. A capital of 1 million at 40% produces 400,000, and a capital of 5 million at 8% also produces 400,000. This is necessary if the result is to remain the same. If it is to grow, on the other hand, the capital must grow in a higher ratio than that in which the profit rate falls. In other words, if the variable component of the total capital is not just to remain the same in absolute terms, but rather to grow, even though its percentage falls as a proportion of the total capital, then the total capital must grow in a higher ratio than that at which the percentage of variable capital falls. It must grow so much that in its new composition, it requires not only the former amount of variable capital, but still more than this for the purchase of labor power. If the variable part of a capital of 100 falls from 40 to 20, the total capital must rise to more than 200 if it is to deploy a variable capital of more than 40. Even if the exploited mass of the working population remains constant, and it is only the length and intensity of the working day that increases, the mass of capital applied still must rise, since it must rise even if the same mass of labor is to be deployed under the former conditions of exploitation, with an altered composition of capital. Thus, the same development in the social productivity of labor is expressed with the advance of the capitalist mode of production, on the one hand in a progressive tendency for the rate of profit to fall, and on the other in a constant growth in the absolute mass of the surplus value or profit appropriated, so that by and large, the relative decline in the variable capital and profit goes together with an absolute increase in both. This twofold effect, as explained, can be expressed only in a growth in the total social capital that takes place more rapidly than the fall in the rate of profit. In order to apply an absolutely greater variable capital at a higher composition, or with a relatively steeper increase in the constant capital, the total capital must grow not only in the same proportion as this higher composition, but still faster than it. It follows from this that the more the capitalist mode of production is developed, the more an ever greater amount of capital is needed to employ the same amount of labor power, and this is still more the case if the amount of labor power is growing. The rising productivity of labor thus necessarily gives rise, on the capitalist basis, to a permanent apparent surplus working population. If the variable capital forms only a sixth of the total capital instead of a half as formerly, then in order to employ the same amount of labor power, the total capital must be tripled. But if it is to employ double the labor power, this capital must be increased sixfold. Previous economists, not knowing how to explain the law of the falling rate of profit, invoked the rising mass of profit, the growth in its absolute amount, whether for the individual capitalist or for the social capital as a whole, as a kind of consolation. But this was also based on mere commonplaces and imagined possibilities. It is no more than a tautology to say that the mass of profit is determined by two factors, firstly by the rate of profit, and secondly by the mass of capital applied at this rate. The fact that the mass of profit may possibly grow, therefore, despite a simultaneous fall in the rate of profit, is only an expression of this tautology, and does not get us a single step further, since it is equally possible for the capital to grow without the mass of profit growing, and indeed the capital might even grow while the mass of profit falls. For instance, 25% on 100 gives 25, while 5% on 400 gives only 20. But if the same things that make the profit rate fall also promote accumulation, i.e. the formation of additional capital, and if all additional capital also sets additional labor in motion and produces additional surplus value, if on the one hand the very fact of the fall in the rate of profit means that the constant capital, and with it the total amount of the former capital, has grown, then the entire process ceases to be a mystery. We shall see later on how resort was made to deliberate miscalculation in an attempt to swindle away the possibility of an increase in the mass of profit together with a decline in the profit rate. We have seen how it is that the same things that produce a tendential fall in the general rate of profit also bring about an accelerated accumulation of capital and hence a growth in the absolute magnitude or total mass of the surplus labor, and therefore the surplus value and profit appropriated by it. Just as everything is expressed upside down in competition, and hence in the consciousness of its agents, so too is this law. I mean this inner and necessary connection between two apparently contradictory phenomena. It is evident that on the figures given above, a capitalist controlling a large capital will make more profit, in absolute terms, than a smaller capitalist making apparently high profits. The most superficial examination of competition also shows that under certain conditions, if the bigger capitalist wants to make more room for himself on the market and expel the smaller capitalist, as in times of crisis, he makes practical use of this advantage and deliberately lowers his profit rate in order to drive the smaller ones from the field. Commercial capital in particular, which we shall discuss in more detail later, also exhibits phenomena that allow the fall in profit to be seen as a result of the expansion of business, and hence of the capital concerned. We shall give the proper scientific expression for this false conception later on. Similar superficial considerations arise from comparing the rates of profit that are made in particular branches of business, according to whether these are subject to the regime of free competition or to monopoly. The entire shallow conception that thrives in the heads of the agents of competition can be found in our Rocher, namely his assertion that this reduction in the rate of profit is more clever and more humane. Here, the decline in the rate of profit appears as a result of the increase of capital, and the capitalist's consequent calculation that a lower rate of profit will enable him to tuck away a greater mass of profit. All this, with the exception of Adam Smith, on whom more later, is based on a complete misconception of what the general rate of profit actually is, and on the crude idea that prices are determined by adding a more or less arbitrary quota of profit onto the commodity's actual value. Crude as these notions are, they are a necessary product of the upside-down way that the immanent laws of capitalist production present themselves within competition. The law that the fall in the rate of profit, occasioned by the development of productivity, is accompanied by an increase in the mass of profit is also expressed in this way. The fall in the price of commodities produced by capital is accompanied by a relative rise in the amount of profit contained in them, and realized by their sale. Since the development of productivity and the higher composition of capital corresponding to it leads to an ever greater amount of means of production being set in motion by an ever smaller amount of labor, each aliquot part of the total product, each individual commodity or each specific group of commodities absorbs less living labor and also contains less objectified labor, both in terms of the depreciation of the fixed capital applied and in terms of the raw and ancillary materials that are consumed. Each individual commodity therefore contains a smaller sum of labor, objectified in means of production, and labor newly added in the course of production. The price of the individual commodity therefore falls. The profit contained in the individual commodity may still increase for all that, if the rate of absolute or relative surplus value rises. It contains less newly added labor, but the unpaid portion of this labor grows in proportion to the paid part. Yet this is only true within certain definite limits. With the enormous decrease, in the course of the advance of production, of the absolute amount of living labor newly added to the individual commodity, the unpaid labor it contains also undergoes an absolute decline, no matter how much it may have grown in relation to the paid portion. The profit on each individual commodity becomes very much reduced as labor productivity develops, despite the rise in the rate of surplus value. And this reduction, just like the fall in the rate of profit, is slowed down only by the cheapening of the elements of constant capital and other circumstances adduced in Part 1 of this volume, which increase the rate of profit with a given or even falling rate of surplus value. If there is a fall in the price of the individual commodities, whose sum makes up capital's total product, this means nothing more than that a given quantity of labor is realized in a greater mass of commodities, so that each individual commodity contains less labor than before. This is the case even if one part of the constant capital, for example raw material, rises in price. With the exception of isolated cases, for example when the productivity of labor cheapens all the elements of both constant and variable capital to the same extent, the rate of profit will fall, despite the higher rate of surplus value. 1. Because even a greater unpaid portion of the smaller former sum of newly added labor is less than a smaller aliquot unpaid portion of the greater total sum. And 2. Because the higher composition of capital is expressed in the case of the individual commodity in the fact that the whole portion of this commodity's value that represents newly added labor falls in comparison with the portion of value that represents raw material, ancillary materials, and wear and tear of the fixed capital. This change in the proportion between the various components of the individual commodity's price, the decline in the portion of price that represents newly added living labor, and the increase in the portions of price that represent previously objectified labor. This is the form that the decline of the variable capital as against the constant takes in the price of the individual commodity. Just as this decline is absolute for a given amount of capital, for example 100, so it is also absolute for each individual commodity as an aliquot part of the capital reproduced. Even so, the rate of profit, if calculated simply on the price elements of the individual commodity, would be expressed differently from how it actually is, and this is for the following reason. The rate of profit is calculated on the total capital applied, but for a specific period of time, in practice a year. The proportion between the surplus value made and realized in a year and the total capital calculated as a percentage is the rate of profit. And so this is not necessarily identical with the rate of profit in which it is not the year, but rather the turnover period of the capital in question that is taken as the basis of the calculation. It is only if this capital turns over precisely once in the year that the two things coincide. To put it another way, the profit made in the course of the year is simply the sum of the profits on the commodities produced and sold in the course of that year. If we calculate the profit on the cost price of the commodities, we obtain a rate of profit P over K, where P is the profit realized in the course of the year, and K is the sum of the cost prices of the commodities produced and sold in the same period. It is readily apparent that this profit rate P over K can only coincide with the actual profit rate P over C, the mass of profit divided by the total capital, where K is equal to C, i.e. where the capital turns over just once in the year. Let us take three possible situations for an industrial capital. 1. A capital of £8,000 produces and sells 5,000 items of a certain commodity each year at 30 shillings per item, so that its annual turnover is £7,500. On each item, it makes a profit of 10 shillings, a total of 2,500 per year. Each item therefore contains a capital advance of 20 shillings and a profit of 10 shillings, so that the profit rate on each item is 10 over 20, being 50%. In the sum of £7,500 turned over, 5,000 is capital advance and 2,500 is profit. The rate of profit on the turnover, P over K, is similarly 50%. Reckoned on the basis of the total capital, however, the rate of profit P over C is 2,500 over 8,000, i.e. 31 1/4%. 2. Say that the capital now increases to 10,000. As a result of increased labor productivity, it is able to produce 10,000 items of the commodity each year at a cost price of 20 shillings. Say that it sells these with 4 shillings profit on each, i.e. at 24 shillings per item. The price of the annual product is then £12,000, of which 10,000 is capital advance and 2,000 is profit. P over K is 4 over 20, reckoned per item, or 2,000 over 10,000 reckoned on the annual turnover, i.e. in both cases 20%. And since the total capital is equal to the sum of the cost prices, i.e. £10,000, the actual profit rate, P over C, is this time also 20%. 3. Say that the capital grows to 15,000, and the productivity of labor continues to rise, so that it now produces annually some 30,000 items of the commodity at a cost price of 13 shillings each, selling these with 2 shillings profit, i.e. at 15 shillings. The annual turnover is therefore 30,000 times 15 shillings, being £22,500, of which 19,500 is capital advance and 3,000 is profit. P over K is thus 2 over 13, being 3,000 over 19,500, or 15 and 5/13%. P over C, on the other hand, is 3,000 over 15,000, i.e. 20%. We see, therefore, that only in case number 2, where the capital value turned over is the same as the total capital, is the rate of profit on each item of the commodity, or on the sum turned over, the same as the profit rate calculated on the total capital. In case number 1, where the sum turned over is less than the total capital, the profit rate calculated on the cost price of the commodity is higher. In case number 3, where the total capital is less than the sum turned over, this profit rate is less than the actual rate of profit, calculated on the total capital. This is a general rule. In commercial practice, the turnover is generally worked out only roughly. It is assumed that the capital is turned over once as soon as the sum of commodity prices realized reaches the sum of the total capital applied. But the capital can have completed a whole cycle only if the sum of the cost prices of the commodities realized equals the sum of the total capital. We see here once again how important it is in capitalist production not to view the individual commodity or the commodity product of some particular period of time in isolation as a simple commodity. It must rather be viewed as the product of the capital advanced and in relation to the total capital that produces this commodity. Even though the rate of profit cannot just be calculated by measuring the mass of surplus value produced and realized against the portion of capital consumed which reappears in the commodity, but you must rather measure it against this portion plus the portion of capital which is admittedly not consumed but is still applied in production and continues to serve there. Despite this, the mass of profit can nevertheless only be equal to the mass of profit actually contained in the commodities and destined to be realized by their sale. If industrial productivity increases, the price of the individual commodity falls. Less labor is contained in it, both paid and unpaid. The same labor may produce 3 times the product, for instance, in which case 2/3 less labor is needed for each individual item. Since profit can only be a portion of the labor contained in the individual commodity, the profit on each individual commodity must decrease, and this is true within certain limits even if the rate of surplus value rises. In all cases, however, the profit on the total product does not fall below the original mass of profit as long as the capital continues to employ the same mass of workers as before at the same level of exploitation. This can even be the case if fewer workers are employed at a higher level of exploitation. For in the same ratio as the profit on the individual commodity falls, the number of products rises. The mass of profit remains the same, even though it is differently distributed over the sum of commodities, and this in no way changes the distribution between worker and capitalist of the quantity of value created by the newly added labor. The mass of profit can rise, employing the same amount of labor, only if the unpaid surplus labor grows, or with the level of exploitation of labor remaining the same if the number of workers increases. Both of these factors may operate simultaneously. In all these cases, and on the basis of our assumptions, they imply a growth in the constant capital in relation to the variable, and an increase in the total capital applied. The individual commodity contains a smaller amount of profit, and the profit rate falls, even when calculated on the individual commodity. A given quantity of additional labor is expressed in a greater quantity of commodities, and the price of the individual commodity falls. Viewed abstractly, the rate of profit might remain the same despite a fall in the price of the individual commodity as a result of increased productivity, and hence despite a simultaneous increase in the number of these cheaper commodities. For example, if the increase in productivity affected all the ingredients of the commodity uniformly and simultaneously, so that their total price fell in the same proportion as the productivity of labor increased, while the ratio between the various ingredients of the commodity's price remained the same. The rate of profit could even rise if a rise in the rate of surplus value was coupled with a significant reduction in the value of the elements of constant capital, and fixed capital in particular. In practice, however, the rate of profit will fall in the long run, as we have already seen. In no case does the fall in the price of the individual commodity, taken by itself, permit any conclusion as to the rate of profit. It all depends on the size of the total capital involved in its production. Say that the price of 1 yard of material falls from 3 shillings to 1 2/3 shillings. If we know that before the fall in price, 1 2/3 shillings went on constant capital, 2/3 shillings on wages, and 2/3 was profit, while after the fall in price, 1 shilling went on constant capital, 1/3 on wages, and 1/3 was profit, we still do not know whether the rate of profit has remained the same or not. This will depend on whether and by how much the total capital advanced has grown, and how many yards more it produces in a given time. The phenomenon arising from the nature of the capitalist mode of production, that the price of an individual commodity or a given portion of commodities falls with the growing productivity of labor, while the number of commodities rises, that the amount of profit on the individual commodity and the rate of profit on the sum of commodities falls, but the mass of profit on the total sum of commodities rises. This phenomenon simply appears on the surface as a fall in the amount of profit on the individual commodity, a fall in its price, and a growth in the mass of profit on the increased total number of commodities produced by the total social capital, or the total capital of the individual capitalist. The matter is then conceived as if the capitalist voluntarily made less profit on the individual commodity, but compensated himself by the greater number of commodities which he now produces. This conception rests on the notion of profit upon alienation, which is derived from the viewpoint of commercial capital. We have already seen, in parts 4 and 7 of Volume 1, how the growing mass of commodities and the cheapening of the individual commodity that accompanies the rising productivity of labor does not in itself affect the proportion of paid and unpaid labor in the individual commodity, insofar as these commodities do not go towards determining the price of labor power, despite the falling price. Since everything presents a false appearance in competition, is in fact an upside-down one, it is possible for the individual capitalist to imagine, 1. That he reduces his profit on the individual commodity by cutting its price, but makes a bigger profit on account of the greater quantity of commodities that he sells. And 2, that he fixes the price of the individual commodity and then determines the price of the total product by multiplication, whereas the original process is one of division. See Volume 1, Chapter 12. And this multiplication comes in only at second hand, and is correct only on the premise of that division. In point of fact, the vulgar economist does nothing more than translate the peculiar notions of the competition-enslaved capitalist into an ostensibly more theoretical and generalized language, an attempt to demonstrate the validity of these notions. In actual fact, the fall in commodity prices and the rise in the mass of profit on the increased mass of cheapened commodities is simply another expression of the law of the falling profit rate in the context of a simultaneously rising mass of profit. An investigation of how far a falling rate of profit can coincide with rising prices would be no more pertinent here than the earlier point elaborated in Volume 1, in connection with relative surplus value. The capitalist who employs improved, but not yet universally used, methods of production sells below the market price, but above his individual price of production. His profit rate thus rises, until competition cancels this out. In the course of this period of adjustment, the second requirement is fulfilled, i.e. growth in the capital laid out, and according to the level of this growth, the capitalist will then be in a position to employ a portion of the workers employed earlier, perhaps all of them or even a greater number, under the new conditions, and thus to produce the same amount of profit or even a larger amount.